Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
Should we get started?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the Balkan Circle. My name, for people who don't know me, is Mary Newberger. I am a professor of history here at UT Austin and also the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies and the chair of Slavic and Eurasian Studies. I'm happy to be your co-host today for Balkan Circle. Kirill Avramov is my co-host and he's going to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you very much. Today we are having yet one very interesting and intriguing topic, and we are very happy to have Keith Wagner, who has completed the Certificate of Translation and Interpretation from English-French at the Community College of Aurora and a BA in Applied Romance Languages, French and Italian from Metropolitan State University of Denver. He has earned his MA in French Studies from the University of Texas at Austin, and currently he is a PhD student at UT Austin in comparative literature, where he pursues research on the metropolitan status of the French language and culture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Keith is interested specifically in the imaginaries associated with the city of Paris and their translations to other urban environments. He explores the function of emulating and adapting Parisian culture outside of France through the means of material, linguistic, and social culture. So Keith, we're very happy to have you back at Balkan Circle. And today your topic, Mimicking the Metropolis, should be drawing a lot of attention as it has been doing in the past. And I wish you a very good luck and a very productive discussion today.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Dr. Newberger and Dr. Avramov for this opportunity. I think it's even more of an honor to be included in this group of speakers as Balkan Circle gets more and more awesome presenters. So my title is Mimicking the Metropolis, Parisianization as a Path to Modernity in Fin-de-Siècle Bucharest. Sorry, switching between languages. So to start out, I want to take us out of the Fin-de-Siècle. I will be talking about the 19th century, but I wanted to look at present-day Bucharest to see how this topic tracks forward. So Clotilde Armand is originally from France, and in 2020, she began a 4-year term as deputy mayor of Sector 1, Sectorul 1, the richest administrative subdivision in Bucharest. So in the 9 years she has lived in Romania, Armand's political involvement has steadily increased. Part of what got her to this point was her rise through the ranks of the political party USR, Uniunea Salvați România, or Save Romania Union, where she began working closely alongside Nicu Șordan, who is the current mayor of Bucharest. So Bucharest has one general mayor, and then each of the sectors will have what I'm calling a deputy mayor, and that's what Clotilde Armand is. So one of the issues Armand took up in her campaign was trash, sanitization, claiming there was a kind of waste management mafia in Bucharest. So during her campaign, she was frequently photographed with a large black trash bag in hand, cleaning up the streets of the capital with her constituents and some fellow politicians from USR. So at the bottom left here, I have Armand in front of the campaign slogan, Strada cu strada schimbăm România, which translates as, we are changing Romania one street at a time. I thought this was really applicable for thinking about streets, also sanitation, for what I'll be talking about historically. So with this background in mind, I wanted to look at this, not sure what to call it, a meme or a political cartoon. On the right, it comes from a paper called Katsavenci. So we have this title, first of all, Prin Gunoi în Cine, which is a riff on a popular political slogan that was used in the early 20th century by Vintila Brătianu, Prin noi în Cine, which is basically a motto about economic self-sufficiency. So they've changed the noi, we here, to gunoi, which means trash, So I translated it here as basically we can handle the trash ourselves, but really the preposition prin gives you this sense of being like in the trash. It's really loaded imagery here, and they're sort of making a mockery of Armand. So in my translation of the little thought bubble here, the italicized parts actually in the original are in French. So she's saying oui c'est vrai. And hélas, doing this sort of code switching. That's how they portray her. She doesn't really talk like that. She does have a strong French accent in Romanian, but they kind of try to give her this sort of character, and this publication has written several articles about her. What it's saying here is, yes, it's true. I promised to make Bucharest into Micul Paris, which means the little Paris. And that's exactly what I'm doing. It's just that, well, France is 4 centuries ahead of Romania, and the Bucharest of today is like Paris during the time of the Musketeers, when people would throw trash into the street and would empty their, sorry, I just saw a typo there, would empty their chamber pots directly onto the road. So this isn't a quote, this is a caricaturization, but we can take a lot from this. So the creators of this meme are projecting this idea of backwardness, which we constantly confront in Balkan studies. We have this term Micul Paris, arising, which conjures up this old trope that has given Bucharest several iterations of the nicknames over the years. The Paris of the East, Le Petit Paris des Balkans, the little Paris of the Balkans, among others. So what's interesting in this phrase here that they're putting into Armand's mouth, make Bucharest into Micul Paris, implies that the city has still not reached whatever moving target of Parisianness keeps being set. So even in 2021, this comes from, this meme was from June this year, it's as if Bucharest hasn't arrived yet, or some grand plan of realizing the Micul Paris is not complete. So they put Armand in this paparazzi photo on the beach atop the Arc de Triomphe, which is the one in Bucharest, one of the most iconic references to Paris that survives in the architectural landscape, to convey some air of superiority. So I think there are a few interesting parallels, but also important differences between Clotilde Armand's participation in local politics and the situation in Bucharest around 130 years earlier. Having either French people or Francophiles in influential positions is something we see throughout the 1880s and 1890s, when Bucharest had several Francophile mayors and French architects were commissioned to build the city's most important buildings. Moreover, the underlying reason why this type of architectural activity began in Bucharest was sanitation. Beginning in the 1870s, Bucharest was looking to the model that the Baron von Haussmann had created decades earlier in Paris, under the guise, at least, of fixing sanitation problems, but it could just be removing poor people. That being said, Armand is not as architecturally minded. Her emphasis has been focused on spending, which has led to another characterization of her in the press as the quote-unquote manager of the city, as well as promoting green spaces, since Sectorul Unu is known for its vegetation and its parks. There's also been some talk from Armand and Nicu Jordan about taking inspiration from Paris in other ways, such as building a robust network of bike paths. So this trope of Micul Paris continues to be productive. The Parisian influence is still there, but it's taking a slightly different form. Let's go on. All right, so in many popular accounts, Bucharest's Micul Paris phase was the interwar period of the 20th century. So this causes people to pin Parisian influence into a narrow time frame, usually the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. But I'm proposing a different strategy here, and I'm choosing to use the term Parisianization to refer to a process with no distinct start date or endpoint. Over the course of the 19th century, I've seen two things happen. First, the gaze of Francophilia narrows, so generalized French influence evolves into increasingly specific associations with the city of Paris. People in Bucharest collectively assembled a Parisian imaginary out of their ideas. Some had actual memories of being in Paris, some just had dreams of going there someday, or they had just created romanticized visions of Paris. So the second thing that happened in the 19th century, which is what particularly interests me, is that Parisianization shifted from the realm of ideas to the material culture of Bucharest. So printed periodicals, clothing, house furnishings, and buildings were all Parisianized in the last 3 decades of the 19th century. I want to look more into this material dimension of Parisianization, so I've chosen to limit my focus to the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. This doesn't mean that Parisianization ends in 1900 or that it was limited to the Fin-de-Siècle or even the long 19th century. In fact, I don't even consider the 1940s with World War II and a subsequent regime change in Romania to be the end of Parisianization. As we just saw with the case of Clotilde Armand, the Michael Paris trope continues to be resurrected in the present day. And so Parisianization lives on in this kind of punctuated afterlife. The afterlife of Michael Paris is ideational in that it is an orientation of the mind's eye, but it is also material, a relationship to the built environment of Bucharest as a palimpsest, which contains different sites of memory or lieux de mémoire that conjure up a Francophile past and speak to the ever persistent desire to Europeanize. I'm going to start out by talking about French influence leading up to the 1870s. Then I'll look at different aspects of material culture, moving from the way people dress to consumer goods, and then to architecture. After that, I'll look briefly into the idea of Metropolis from a couple of angles. And then to close, I'll touch on the phasing out of the French model in architecture that began at the turn of the century. So the Paris-Bucharest relationship really stems from an older relationship of a broader scope, not city to city, but more on the nation to nation level, except at this point in history, we can't quite refer to Romania as a national entity. Before Romania gained national independence in 1878, the territorial frames of reference are the so-called Romanian Principalities, or in more French historiography, the Danubian Principalities of Moldavia, here on the right, and Wallachia, Valachia, we have here. So a man named Pompilio Eliade wrote a book in 1898 in French, all about French influence in Romania. I have the cover right here, De l'influence française sur l'esprit public en Roumanie, on the French influence on the public spirit in Romania. So as some critics have pointed out, Eliade, no relation to Mircea Eliade as far as I know, definitely had an agenda with this book. He's not merely doing the work of history, he was trying to make a case for how impressive the advancement of Romania had been as a result of assimilating French elements into its spirit. So that being said, the way that Eliade constructs his argument can still provide insight into a complex history of cultural exchanges. What I like is this multiple layerings of French influence. So Eliade synthesizes French influences into a schema based on the 4 cardinal directions. From the south came the influence of the Phanariates, a powerful class of Greeks in Istanbul who had historically had a lot of influence with the Ottoman Sultan because many had acted as drogmans, who are sort of interpreters and cultural attachés all rolled into one. And as such, they knew a lot of languages, the Phanariates, and French was one of the indispensable ones. They also kept extensive libraries, which they stocked increasingly with French books. Phanariot families produced dozens of the hospodars, or rulers of Moldavia and Wallachia. And one of the most notable early ones, Alexandru Ypsilanti, is credited as being the first to institute schooling in French in 1776. So I'm just moving chronologically here, so sorry I'm not going in a counterclockwise or clockwise order. Then from the east, we have a recurring presence of Russian soldiers in Moldavia due to the string of Russo-Turkish wars in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Russian soldiers were not only speaking French with Moldavians, they were imparting their Francophile tastes on them, from European dances to fashion, home furnishings, and vehicles. Then from the west, there were people coming directly from France as early as the 1790s, when some émigrés who left after the French Revolution were put up by boyar families. After Napoleon declared his French Empire in 1806, wealthy families in the Principalities were more motivated than ever to know French. So private French teachers began to flow in at that time, and their presence only increases over the 19th century. So we see some people French people who had originally come as just teachers, sort of like high school teachers, around the 1870s. One was Ulysse de Marcillac. They actually gain really prominent roles in publish books and start newspapers and things like that. So it's definitely an important section of French influence. Then lastly, from the north, Eliade claimed that French influence came via the re-Latinization movement, which is sometimes called Latinization simply or re-Romanization in Transylvania. And this started as a way for Romanian-speaking Austro-Hungarian subjects to lay claim to an identity based on Roman heritage and Latin language ancestry. The movement was heavily manifested through language. Eliade cites the work of Transylvanian grammarians in the first decade of the 19th century. They were among the first to write Romanian in the Latin script, for instance, and tried to eradicate words of non-Latin origin from the language. So the underlying philosophy of re-Latinization was a shared cultural heritage with other speakers of Latin-based languages, French being the most important to them. And that type of thinking would feed a mythos where France is seen as the role of the sœur aînée, the older sister of Romania. And so all of these are happening at slightly different periods of time. And in the end, they layer over each other into a general conglomerated French influence over the territory as a whole. It's also important to point out that Eliade is talking about something intangible, a public spirit. So these different layers of French influence form a sort of ideational or emotional substratum. Romania is being linked to France here through the heart and the mind. And this is an essential starting point for building a Parisian imaginary. This is what I see as the necessary foundation that has allowed the Micul Paris trope to be continuously recycled into the present day. I also pointed out the capitals here. So Moldavia's capital was Iași and Wallachia was Bucharest. And we can go back to that with if we need to. Up until the Principalities united, they had been governed by a separate hospodar. They'd each been governed by a separate hospodar. So the seat of the hospodar of Moldavia was in Iași. The seat of the hospodar of Wallachia was in Bucharest. It happened many times in the 18th and early 19th century that the same person would alternate between the hospodar seats in the two principalities. And they would only serve a year or two at a time in their term. So there's this long-standing pattern of ruling figures going back and forth between Bucharest and Iași. This would all start to change with developments in the 1860s, which really anchored Bucharest's central role in governance. So first off, we have the Union of the Principalities, which was solidified in 1862. It had started in 1859. Bucharest was designated then as the sole capital and the seat of government. Then in May of 1866, Karl of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen arrives in Bucharest from Germany to serve as the new foreign prince to the United Principalities. So then he takes on a Latinized name, Carol. So Prince Carol moved between residences in Bucharest and Iași until 1871, when his summer residence in Sinaia was built. So there was less of an imperative to build out the urban environment of Iași after that point. So the polarization of Bucharest as the country's primary urban center was pretty much fixed from the 1870s onward. Romania was declared a kingdom in 1881, and so the 1880s became a time when King Carol and his wife, Queen Elisabeta, also German in origin, actively drove the development of Bucharest into a city of European caliber. So the king had two French grandmothers and was also raised in a tradition of French being the language of the elites and diplomacy. And then the queen, on her part, was a staunch supporter of arts and culture, musical culture, theater, but she also penned several books in French under the name of Carmen Silva. So we have our Francophone monarchs, and in addition, Bucharest had two mayors in the Fin-de-Siècle period who were seen as Francophiles, Emanuel Protopopescu Pache and Nicolae Filipescu. Protopopescu earned a law degree in France, but he also studied in Francophone institutions in both Switzerland and Belgium. His term of office is associated with rapid progress in modernizing Bucharest. Electric lighting and telephones were introduced, urban legislation passed, and the streets were improved through paving and the building of canals. Nicolae Filipescu went to high school in Geneva and then to university in Paris. During the time he served as mayor, an electric tramway began running and several major boulevards and urban parks were built. So these figures were really at the top of the ladder of society, and they were sympathetic to the French language and cultural values. So they saw it as a natural thing that Bucharest would look to Paris in its quest to modernize. So it wasn't only the people of the highest stature who liked French things. I was inspired to look at the aspect of clothing in more detail after our conversation in Balkan Circle a few weeks ago during the presentation of Iovo about what people were wearing in Saint-Jacques and to make their affiliations legible, so to speak, through their clothing. So the way people dressed in Bucharest was in a state of flux for most of the 19th century. There are accounts of people going around the city in long Ottoman-style robes, at least until the 1820s, while at the same time, other people were opting for more Western European-style suits and dresses. So I think this quote at the top gives us a good snapshot of the way an outsider saw things in the middle of the century. Eugène Poujade served as French consul in Bucharest from 1849 to 1854. So it was during this time that he observed that it's the city of contrasts. Elegant men and women dressed in the latest Parisian fashions, and peasants dressed like the Dacians from 2,000 years ago. Not the most flattering portrayal. So the photo on the left is from a few decades after this Poujade quote, but I hope you can see it. We can see two ladies and a girl sort of in the center walking in their European style dresses past a man and a woman to their left who are wearing the traditional peasant style clothing. And this really gives you a sense of the mixture in the city. Clearly not everyone came from an economic background that allowed them to dress in so-called European fashions. Anca Bratulianu has an article where she points out that the turn of the century saw a new social class emerge and homogenize, the petite bourgeoisie. So the petite bourgeoisie weren't boyard or old money people, so there's maybe a little bit of insecurity in their ability to present the right appearance. They wanted to be associated with high culture and the elevated social status that came in the 1890s was associated with the Parisian aesthetic. So in the middle photo here, I have an ad for a men's tailor pulled from an 1890 Bucharest directory. And to the right is the cover of Moda Parisiana, Teatru și Muzica. This magazine was meant for a female readership and is full of clues into what a petit bourgeois woman's life might have been like at the time. So I want to show you a actual full issue of this magazine to sort of show you what's happening here. We have color illustrations with the latest fashions. It's really it's showing clothes, and the first column, the editorial, is always signed by someone under the name Dernier Chic, the latest fashion. That's why I titled that slide this way. And then there are lots of sort of literary supplements, and we even have one here by Carmen Silva, the queen. And then all of these sort of images of women who are in the Parisian style. And then at the back of every edition, you have sheet music, because also it wasn't enough to just look good and be well read. You needed to be skilled at playing the piano, apparently, too. But as I paged through some of the editions, some other editions of Moda Parisiana, I found an interesting section in the back pages called Baluri și Serate, Balls and Soirées. And this documents the most high society social events in Bucharest between the late 1890s and first few years of the 1900s. And there's a sort of who's who of attendees listed. And here we see the names of Francophile mayors and politicians. Like in 1898 issues, I saw the name of Protopopescu, who I was just showing you all, come up as being in attendance. So these publications are really helpful, and I think it helps to look at the quote unquote women's publications to see a whole section of the population which is not really represented in the other Francophone press at the time. But of course, this is, like I said, only a small section of the urban population, the petite bourgeoisie and upward, not sort of the way everyone was living. And also, since it's nice to have a female perspective, since these stories of architects and local politicians are so full of male names, and we cannot ignore that the female urban population were drivers of taste, so we can pull a lot from the kinds of things that were marketed to them. And all in all, I think that by looking at clothing, we can get a sense of the move toward increasingly material displays of Parisianness. It's all about external representation. So in Walter Benjamin's essay, Paris, the Capital of the 19th Century, he recounts that Parisian arcades were built starting in 1822 and allowed several boutiques to be separated only by glass walls. This is where the Magasin de Nouveauté take form, selling all kinds of goods. Benjamin takes this as a case study for the huge increase in commodification in the 19th century. Fin-de-Siècle Bucharest is no different than the Paris that Benjamin was describing. You can see on the left an ad from a French language newspaper, L'Indépendance Roumaine, for a store called the Grand Magasin du Printemps. And one of the main thing it's advertising here, the single word placed below the name is Nouveauté. And then on the bottom right, we have a photo of a store called Aux Villes de France, which was opened from 1872 to 1891. They offered luxury tailoring services. They sort of had a master tailor who was a French woman, Madame Paul. They sold fabric. And as Emmanuel Badescu's description specifies, in the book I got this illustration from, they sold what he refers to as noutăți vestimentare, sartorial novelties. So the fact that, so noutăți is the Romanian equivalent of nouveauté, in English we say novelties. The fact that the word novelties was used so frequently in this era to inspecifically describe the items sold in a given place tells us that all the emphasis was really placed on the quality of newness in the merchandise. And so I think this word embodies the spirit of modernity in a way, out with the old, in with the new. So this research project is, apart from this presentation, is also leading up to a paper I will be delivering at the MLA convention this upcoming January, in a 19th century French session called Metropole. That's why I put Metropolis into my title, and I've been trying to interrogate sort of how the idea of Metropolis fits into the Paris-Bucharest relationship. And I think that we can look at it from at least two angles. First, we can view Paris in the position of metropole in relation to colonies. Although Romania was never a part of the French colonial project, several scholars have likened it to a type of self-selected cultural colony of France. Anne Quinney uses this term in a French and Francophone studies paper, and this is really just a recycling of a phrase attributed to the Romanian French writer Benjamin Fondan or Benjamin Fundoianu, depending on which version of his name you take, in the early 20th century. So Fundoianu used the term colonie culturelle, Romania as a cultural colony of France. And then we have Neago Juvara, a well-respected Romanian historian, writing, from the beginning of the 19th century until the First World War, Romanians were literally colonized by France without the presence of the colonizer. So there's this notion of self-selected colonization. But by contrast, we can look at Bucharest itself as a city that began to assume a metropolitan identity, or a metropolitan status in the Fin-de-Siècle. So under Napoleon, Paris presented this example of concentrating power and population into a centralized capital. And Bucharest started to follow this model around the 1880s, as I showed with the ascent of King Carol to the throne and the decreasing prominence of Iași after the Principalities united. Bucharest had a role to fulfill and needed to become the symbol of progress for the rest of the country. Therefore, it was important to broadcast an image of urbanized modernity, particularly Western European urbanized modernity, out to the rest of the country. Now looking into the built environment, we can start to piece together an architectural archive of Parisianization. So one of the first areas I think we can see this idea of the metropolis playing out is with larger shops and hotels. They don't necessarily need to be large in size to be called a grand magasin or a grand hôtel. The word is just as much a gesture to to being perceived as important, to wanting to be perceived as important. This adjective alone invites a point of reflection, since in French, grand, big, is the antonym of petit, little. The connotations of Parisian grandeur going alongside grand magasin, grands hôtels are entering into a space that's been given a diminutive nickname, le petit Paris, the little Paris, micul Paris. So I'm not trying to insinuate that business names with grand in Bucharest were overt signs of defensiveness against an inferiority complex. I just think the relationship of the terms grand, petit really helped to capture this spirit of mimicry. We can also see that with the older sister trope. You know, Bucharest is the smaller sibling of Paris, or Romania is the smaller sibling of France. On a grander scale. So numerous grands hôtels popped up in the Fin-de-Siècle, but I've chosen just two here, especially for their names. On the bottom left, we have the Hôtel Metropole, and on the right is the Hôtel de France. A couple of other major hotels not pictured here were the Grand Hôtel du Boulevard and the Kantaku Palace Hotel. And so these usually sported Haussmann-style facades and were mostly built by French architects or Romanian architects who had trained in France. So the upper left is sort of a street scene you can see with all the awnings and the building style. So maybe not completely in the Haussmann style, because the levels are not all perfectly aligned, but we definitely see French influence coming in here. So to talk about the architects who were building these buildings, Ana Maria Zahariade, a professor at the Ion Mincu Architecture University in Bucharest, points out that architecture, unlike, say, the fields of literature or even classical music, was directly focused on Paris. She says what made architectural development distinct from other artistic fields was the fact that from the beginning, architecture was focused directly and almost exclusively on Paris. The reason for this is nearly all the architects who built prominent buildings in the second half of the 19th century in Bucharest had gotten their training at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and were keen to emulate the style that had influenced Haussmann and Napoleon III's Grands Travaux, their big works of construction. So this is not all of the buildings in Bucharest. Architectural historian Bogdan Andrei Fez, he's also at Ion Mincu, he makes sure to point out that French architects were actually a numerical minority in the city. They just happened to get commissions for the most prominent buildings. So I have a non-exhaustive list here of architects who trained at the École des Beaux-Arts and oversaw the construction of prominent buildings in Bucharest between 1870 and 1900. So there are more. This is just sort of limited by time. So among the French architects, Michel Saint-Jouan and Xavier Villeprost had actually served as chief architects of the city of Bucharest more in the mid-19th century. And these others were sort of, they came to Bucharest for specific projects from Paris. Then we have a number of Romanian architects who went to Paris, trained at the École des Beaux-Arts, and the sort of highest distinction they could receive was called the DPLG, Diplômé par le gouvernement. It means you're awarded a diploma by the government. So this distinction was received by multiple, but the first of them was Ion Mincu. And this is why his namesake went to the primary architectural training institution in Romania today. So street lighting was a mark of modernity for any city in the 19th century, and Bucharest became the first city in the world to light its streets with petrol lamps in 1857. The petrol was coming from Ploiești, a city near Bucharest, and incidentally, the Ploiești oil fields were also the source of a lot of the wealth for many of the families who had Parisian-style stately residences built in Bucharest. So on the left, we can see a man dressed in traditional Romanian peasant garb carrying gas cans. I love the sort of Art Nouveau lines here. This is from a 1906 book, so it really captures the spirit of the times. And something interesting I found while looking through archival materials is in the center, we have this ad for La Compagnie du Gaz de Bucarest, the gas company of Bucharest, stating that this is for one, a Paris-based firm. So for a period in the 1880s and 1890s, gas and petrol were actually controlled from France and mostly by French people. If you look at some of the names of the board of directors, Alexandre Tassin, Verneau, Gérard, we do have at least Berkovic, a Romanian, at the bottom. But it brings a little extra nuance, I think, to this idea of the metropole colony question. I mean, power over the gas and petrol would eventually come back to Bucharest, but for a time, just it being controlled from Paris really has that colonial resonance. Between 1878 and 1899, the percentage of paved streets went from 30% to 82% in Bucharest. So many of the streets were actually renamed also, and with good cause. Not only do boulevards appear, so we see the name boulevard, come into the language and naming systems in Bucharest, but one of the most prominent avenues had its name changed. So it started out as Podul Mogușoaie. Podul literally means bridge and is a reference to the way unpaved streets, just basically muddy roads, had wooden planks laid over them to make them more navigable, like bridges. So Podul Mogușoaie became Calea Victoriei, the road of victory, after 1878. And this was a transition in the naming of the type of road from Podul to Calea, usually translated as avenue, as well as the focus of the meaning. So rather than, so Podul Mogușoaie means the bridge toward Mogoșoaia. So that's the idea of heading to this princely residence. Mogoșoaia was a residence where nobility lived. So this modern avenue of Calea Victoriei evokes victory for the nascent Romanian nation. It is the street where most of the cultural heritage lies still today, and is consequently in Sectorul 1, Clotilde Armand's domain. Aside from paving the streets, one of the main ways the Parisian model was followed in Bucharest's urban planning was the use of percées, the popularity of which goes, credit for them being popular goes to Haussmann and Napoleon III's sort of bulldozing efforts through Parisian neighborhoods in order to make diagonal trajectories through the city. That's what percer literally means, to pierce. It's like a, or something that's like pierced through. And so they were these opening up, the percées were said to open up streets and were intended to improve circulation. So on the right, I have a map of the different percées in the Bucharest cityscape in this period, at least up until 1921 or later in the 1920s. So if you can see, all of the dotted lines here are these sort of axes that were created and that went right through buildings. So as far as specific examples, I just have a couple, but I think they're sort of emblematic of broader patterns. So to start out, I want to look into shared public spaces. So I think we can take a lot from thinking about what Bucharest looked like before. It was the same city of contrasts we saw in the comment from Pujad regarding clothing. So people describe this upper picture on the left. People use the term huts a lot. So they describe these huts are interspersed in the city with more, aesthetically pleasing, I should say, architecture. So even this caption, mélange de beaux palais pauvres, is a mixture of beautiful palaces and poor huts. Within that older Bucharest, there were these establishments that were called Hans. So on the bottom left, we have Hanul lui Manuk, which is still standing today, but many more existed in the past. So Hans were inns that lodged people, but also had central courtyards where merchants could do business. So the time of the Hans might create that quote unquote Oriental image of old Bucharest. However, with Parisianization, the Hans slowly die out. But a space of public interchange that emerges is the passage. The Parisian ones, or so we call them arcades in English, the Parisian passage were made famous by Walter Benjamin in the Arcades project. and they certainly brought a feeling of Paris to Bucharest. So here I have pictures from one of the passages, which still is functioning today. It's Passage Maca Villacross, same Villacross as Xavier Villacross, who was same family, the former chief architect of the city. This was made by a Frenchman, Félix Stenopol, who had sort of inherited a property because he was married to a Romanian woman of Greek Phanariot descendancy. So this sort of the passage embodied the 19th century styles of architecture, both because of their iron and glass roofs. So iron and glass architecture is something that's sort of an innovation of the time. But also the way that they cut through buildings to basically make a covered street. And in this one specifically, you have a lot of these Parisian style cafes. So people might have been drinking coffee in a completely different way in the Hans, but now they're sitting in more of these terrace settings, and this will continue more into the early 20th century. So you can also see the roof on the lower right here of the passage. So this is sort of how public spaces are changing. And then as my sort of last prototypical building to show for stately residences, I chose the Palatul Kantaku. It's really well known, one of the most prominent buildings on the Calea Victoriei. So this was made by a Romanian architect, Ion Berendei. He was actually sort of a second generation in this French tradition. His father, Dumitru Berendei, had been Minister of Public Works in Romania. And then Ion, followed in his footsteps, trained at the École des Beaux-Arts. And he was commissioned to make this this palace for the Kantaku family, which who were prominent mayors and sort of Phanariot descendants. And so I think one of the most notable features of this is this awning. It's called either a copertina de sticle, a glass copertina, or a marquise. So this specifically is a marquise en coada de paon, a peacock tail shaped awning. And so this is made with, again, the iron and glass architecture that's so emblematic of the Fin-de-Siècle. But it's also got these organic lines. So this is either like a shell or a peacock tail seashell. This is common, and these popped up in stately residences all over Bucharest. So this is the style of Art Nouveau, taking its influence. And what this really exemplifies is a style called French eclecticism. So these marquises were inspired by what are called édicules that were designed by Hector Guimard in Paris. You can see them as the entrances to the Art Nouveau metro stations. So the idea was really taken and it was put onto houses. So it's taken from public space use in Paris to go to these houses in Bucharest. So there are many of them, but I think this one's really exemplary, and this style of eclecticism shows sort of the height with the buildings that Ion Berendei built, because he's sort of the witness to the period of transition into a national Romanian style. So lastly, we have some limits to this French model. So Bogdan Andrei Fez, again, he wrote a whole book on this, on the French influence between 1831 and 1921 in Bucharest. So he insists that the French model was exactly that, only a template to be applied in order to resolve specific problems like sanitation, circulation in the streets. But there was never an end goal of fully turning the city into a little Paris. So he says here in this quote, sorry, I didn't translate these from French, the French model isn't going toward a copy of the Parisian image, but it serves really as an instrument in resolving problems. And so at the end of the 19th century, architects are starting to use a national Romanian style. And this sort of goes hand in hand with the formation of professional architecture associations and later architectural training institutions in Bucharest. As Anna Maria Zahariade reports, in 1890, a Frenchman named Edmond de Joly encouraged Romanian architects to establish their own sort of homegrown architecture schools and journals. So out of that moment comes the foundation of an architectural journal in 1890, Annalele Arhitecturae. Then in 1891, we have the Society of Romanian Architects established. 1897, the National School of Architecture, or it became the National School in 1897, had existed since around 1892, or was an offshoot of the School of like Public Works, Pont et Chaussée, Poduri Șoseaua. And this later became the Ion Mincu University of Architecture, which is where Fez currently teaches and trained, also Zahariade. And it bears the name, as I mentioned before, of Ion Mincu. Then we have a journal started in 1906. And this is really what brings us out of this focus on only Parisian architecture and into a mixture of styles. But as I said before, the sort of punctuated afterlife of Micul Paris continues. And that is all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith. I believe my co-host on the auditorium thoroughly enjoyed your really rich paper and your panoramic view of the process of using French templates and trying to turn Bucharest into Micul Paris. In this regard, before, as you know, we do have a way of engaging in a conversation in Balkan Circle. So we will start. I'll ask my co-host, Professor Neuberger, to ask the first questions. I certainly have two for you, and then to remind everyone to either post them in the chat or address them. So thank you, Keith. Professor Neuberger.
Okay, I will start. I loved your presentation. It was fascinating. I have like a million notes. I'm trying to sort of gather and compact these so I don't like spend the next 30 minutes dominating the conversation. But so first, I guess thinking back a little bit to the Ottoman period, I was fascinated because there was this concept of alafranga in the Ottoman period where anything kind of Western or European was couched in terms of in the French style, alafranga. And so you had a shared kind of Ottoman elite culture that was highly influenced by sort of Turco-Ottoman culture. And alafranga actually in many ways came via the Turks and via Istanbul, at least to Bulgaria. So alafranga wasn't coming necessarily directly from France only. It was being filtered through kind of all these other sources. And so it was something that like very much hybridized into Ottoman elite material culture in interesting ways. And actually in households of Christian elites, they would have an alafranga corner where they would have artifacts, like they might have a teapot or like whatever they had that was French that they would show off in their, it was like a sort of a niche, an alafranga niche. But that's like with that as a lead-in, I want to say that some of these same processes and much reduced kind of level also happened in Bulgaria, like the Haussmannization of Sofia and Plovdiv to a lesser extent, the adoption of Western material culture. But there it provoked significant, I would say, also ambivalence and resistance, a sense of loss, where like we don't recognize our own cities anymore because they're all sort of homogeneous, they look like a Western city. Where did my city go? So much was knocked down in doing that. And there was even like a sense, if you look even at 19th century Russian or Bulgarian literature, like for example, Under the Yoke, written by Ivan Vazov, where you have these alafranga characters who are kind of made fun of as being like, mimicking the West and they're foppery and they're not the real characters in the story in some ways. They're kind of, you know what I'm saying? And this ambivalence becomes a huge factor in tension between kind of the city and the countryside in the Bulgarian imaginary, where the cities come to seem as a sort of foreign cancer on the country, which becomes really intensified in interwar politics and writings. So I know that's all to say, I'm wondering if in Romania there were also the kind of ambivalences and resistances and outright, you know, rejection. I mean, you mentioned the sort of colonization trope, but of this kind of Westernization. I mean, I know the relationship to France is very different, but still, especially among sort of nativist, you know, kind of movements, did you have those kind of trends? That's my long question. Yay. Okay, go ahead.
Well, yes. I'm sure that these come up, and I'm seeing a comment in the chat from Catalina about Ion Luca Carajale. Yeah, that's a great example, and I don't think I know enough to fully answer this to find those tropes. But yeah, in the theater of so theatrical works, I've read a certain scholar, Stamatoyo. He has characterized this phenomenon in Carajale's work as franco-afwane. So instead of people being francophone, they are franco-aphones. Like they are butchering the French language and doing these comical things just to try to project this image. So so I peripherally know a little bit about that, but would absolutely like to dive in more for the sort of how people are mocked in the urban setting. I also thought of, when you were talking about this book by the Under the Yoke, I have, since we had talked about this originally, Dr. Neuberger, a few years ago, I've read Felatun Bey and Rakım Efendi, which is a Turkish one that takes that dandy trope, the alafranga thing, and really mocks it. So I definitely want to look more into that. But I didn't dive into the rural situation in the countryside really as much as, you know, I would like to now. So I'm not sure really what the reception was from there of how people were seeing the image of the capital changing and things like that. It's a lot more, I guess, observations from outsiders. So I definitely would like to explore more of that, I guess, in a way, the subaltern approach, like looking at these other people who are not just sort of the upper movers and shakers of society. Yeah,
I guess I was also talking about urbanites, urban intellectuals, but who had this imaginary of the purity of the countryside. You know, they themselves were criticizing the city as foreign, even though they were part of that culture. But, you know, that sort of embrace of blood and soil.
In essence, I would agree, because while listening to you, in my mind, clearly, Keith, the criteria for modernization, for certain populations' emulation in terms of ideational and material culture, quote unquote, from your presentation, I was also thinking immediately about what competing ideational and material representation you have in the city itself, as I'm assuming that it will be in the nativist position. And I think that if that's part of the paper, probably will just even highlight, you know, even more this slide that I enjoyed a lot with the template that needs to be just used just as that, you know, in the architecture. But I have a question on your first slide, if you can comment, because I know that the topic is historical, but I was fascinated how your narrative arc, you know, drove us from today's Bucharest, or contemporary Bucharest, 2021, I believe, was the meme that you showed us first. And, you know, had this panoramic historical overview of ideation and material culture. I was wondering in my mind about a question which was prominent, for instance, in Bulgaria in the beginning of the transition, pertaining to Francophonie, whether and Zheluzhelev was known for his affinity, the first Bulgarian democratically elected president, for his affinity for Francophonie and so on. So it was an important question even outside of Romania as to who belongs to the cultural sphere of influence. But I also was wondering what, if you've seen today, are the manifestation of Francophonie in terms of ideation and material culture representation. I mean, you've given us one example, but I would be curious if you have others, that you have spotted. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'd say it's much less Francophonie as in people speaking French, just because English is the popular foreign language in Romania today, but I definitely see recycling of that trope with the Micul Paris. So one of the things I do as, I guess, informal research is I follow the hashtag Micul Paris on Instagram. And so I am kind of watching how people are re-signifying these landscapes and even in some ways complicating that situation. So I think that there's a way of they're using that Paris image for tourism and sort of having an appreciation of the city. But sometimes there's I could think of one example of a critical reception in contemporary culture. It's a rap group called Bug Mafia, B-U-G Mafia. They have a song called Micul Paris, and they're like talking about how even though we're in this form of Paris, we're still broke. So that's so those are some ways of engaging with it, but then there's Francophonie also as the international organization OIF. I know that Bucharest has hosted a summit of the organization in recent years, but I think what even got me on this entire path to researching the influence was when I went to Bucharest in 2015. I was looking for the Parisian image, and I found a place called Piazza Francophonie, and it's basically the place of Francophones, and it's just like a very small monument that doesn't seem Parisian at all, and so I sort of thought it was sort of dead. That it's just sort of like on paper, maybe.
The expectation and the imaginary, I guess, right? Thank you for your great answer, and I know that those are not an easy ones because you cover such a big period. But at this point of time, I would like to invite our audience, because you already have raised hands, and I would ask Nuri to pose his question. Nuri?
Thank you, Kirill. Hello, everyone. Keith, thanks so much for your presentation. Last week, we have seen how actually Italian fascism affected politically Romania. And I was wondering how it didn't affect actually the architecture of it. Because as Mary said before, Italian way of architecture, even in the Ottoman Empire, was quite interesting thing, because in the late 19th century and early 20th century, we have seen so many Italian architects coming to Istanbul because Sultan invited them to make the city more beautiful and look a bit more Western, let's say European. And I was wondering actually how it didn't cross through Romania somehow. But the interesting thing is that perhaps maybe this is a bit contemporary aspect of it, because we know that also the Ceausescu era ended quite interesting with him building this massive palace in Bucharest. So how it actually connected the, let's say, Romanian population with him building this palace in a very difficult and politically sensitive let's say, environment. Thank you.
So I'm just making sure I'm understanding the question. So you're wondering about how in the fascist period or later the communist and Ceausescu's sort of how the architecture was impacted by that?
Yeah, actually, yeah. Because I mean, how this, let's say, well, now when we look at the buildings, especially when I walk today in Italy, I can easily identify this is a fascist building, this is an old, or let's say this is a neoclassic building, because either if there is not a balcony, if there is this racial architecture or this type of situation. So when we look at the contemporary architecture of Romania, especially in this palace that was built by Ceausescu, I mean, what type of traces it has, because it doesn't look also totally, let's say, communist at all. Looks really little bit, but not.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of things that happened. It's interesting with sort of like the fascist period. One of the most interesting things that happened in Bucharest with architecture is that old Orthodox churches were moved. They carved out these sort of channels in the streets and moved the entire things. And so there's this sort of older architecture, and also this is part of the competing, images in Bucharest, is you still have this image of orthodoxy, which is, not reflective of Paris at all. So that's one of the things that happened. But a term that I really love with associating with Ceausescu and his renovations and the palace and everything is Ceaușima, which is sort of a mocking way to liken what he did to Hiroshima, like it was just like a bomb exploded in over the city with these renovations. But also what he did is very similar to the story of Haussmann, I think, the Baron von Haussmann. He was prefect of the city, working with Napoleon III in these meetings closely to make these plans. And Ceausescu would, and I don't want to say the wrong name of the architect, I want to say Antonescu, but please don't quote me. I'm not an architectural historian, but Ceausescu would go into these planning meetings and really say what he wanted to happen. So I think there's, in a way, there's a little spirit of the Haussmannization, but not the same looking architectural style. So I can't really give you a formal analysis of the Palace of the People. I think it has some neoclassical elements, but also absolutely Bucharest has brutalist architecture that pops up in the 20th century. And so and a lot of these buildings don't still stand that were part of that Paris era. So I think there is I really like the idea of the palimpsest of the city, these many layerings, and people can read in differently to those things.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Keith. And Nuri, I hope he addressed it well, and that answers partially your question. But do I see that Catalina Hunt is asking a question?
Yes, I'm teaching in actually 7 minutes. So I would like to congratulate Keith. I teach at Kenyon College in Ohio. And I'm an Ottoman historian. I study the Muslims of Romania. But as part of that study is this question of modernization of Romania, because I study the period 1839-1914. So what I find fascinating about this is that Romania is trying to find itself during this period. Its identity, it's very ambiguous to Romanians. So they're trying to borrow all these foreign elements. They're trying to transform their language. They're making it more Latin. They're purging Slavic elements from it. They're bringing it in cultural elements that are more familiar to them, like the French one, because Romanian is a Romance language, trying to approach particular policies towards minorities. So it's a process of transformation that starts with the elites. And my question was, considering the complexity of modernization in general, do you think that this is a process that is pervasive, is strong at that period, turning the culture of Romania into a French culture at this time? Does it even, influence the masses in such a way as to impact largely not only the way the people live, but their mentalities? People don't know who they are at this time. So I wonder how pervasive is this French element. I'm trying to also think about this, because the Ottoman influence is still very strong. because Romanian countries were part of the Ottoman Empire, though not directly administered, but Ottoman culture is there, the food is there, the music is there, part of the language is there, the administration is still in there. Prince Karl of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen is a German who speaks French and who pays respect to the Ottoman Sultan. So there's so much ambiguity in there, and I think your study is so important to just emphasize how the French aspect is just one of the many very complex issues that were arising at this point. They are in Romania, in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, in Europe in general.
Thank you, Catalina. Thank
So
you for your question and intervention. It's very nice to hear this.
If you need to leave, that's fine. This will be taped, and you can always go listen to your answer later.
Sure, but Keith, if you need to get in touch with me, please, I welcome the dialogue, because I also am trying to write a book now in which I incorporate these ideas. So it would be a very fruitful exchange of ideas. So I can leave my email here. I have to go. I'm so sorry.
Thank you. It's okay.
Thank you. It will be taped.
Your series is fascinating. I just discovered it, and I absolutely respect it and like it. So.
I would love to write for you. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming, Catalina.
So Keith, do you want to address that with a comment? Because
sure, yeah.
I mean, we are recording, so we can, for everyone else's benefit, Catalina can also hear it later if she has to duck out during it.
Yeah, so as far as the pervasiveness, I think I was trying to touch on this whole idea of the petite bourgeoisie and sort of like the upper levels of society. I don't think it was necessarily, widespread across the urban culture. It definitely, you had to be in a certain socioeconomic class and to even to want certain things in life, to present a certain image and find value in that. So so just based on that, I would say that it doesn't pervade to all levels of Romanian society, because I know also from 1848 onward, there's a very much nationalist movement, and writers are trying to write in a language and sort of build a literature, all that sort of a thing. So that's definitely something competing, but I don't think I know enough to look at how this influences the rest of society, or whether it does.
But it's a lot of good things to think about, isn't it, Keith?
Yes.
So speaking of that, so Emma Grama had a comment or a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to ask it yourself so that we can hear your voice and see your face. But if not, I can ask it for you. Seems like she's muted, so who knows what's, but so I'll go ahead and ask it. She was just wondering like how this fits into your larger dissertation project or research arguments of your larger dissertation, or is that still in the formative stage?
Very much in the formative stage. I haven't even taken my comprehensive exam, so I haven't, I'm not even at a stage of making a proposal for a dissertation. So it's in the formative stage. I love thinking about cities and architecture in the built environment, but I'm in a program that trains in literature. So what I see as of now is that maybe built environment / material culture would sort of be one chapter, and maybe this specific period, the Fin-de-Siècle, and then having different two other chapters that focus on the continued exchanges between Paris and Bucharest. So as far as I'm thinking now, I would like it to sort of end with, so this being an initial stage when Paris has this presence, so to speak, or the idea of Paris has this presence in Bucharest. But then I would like to get to the point where by the mid 20th century, we have Romanians in Paris who are sort of using these environments the environment as a sort of incubator for Romanian cultural life, a very different subset of people who are not the elites. But so one particular figure I, as of now, would like to center around, who I haven't done much research on, is Monica Lovinescu, the daughter of Eugen Lovinescu, both literary critics. And so she had a sort of circle of artistic literary people around her. And so I kind of want to move. So that's the trajectory. I want to move from maybe the dream of Paris, the imaginary of Paris existing in Romania, to then the actual situation in Paris itself, and sort of where's the Bucharest on the Seine, as I've heard referred to. Yeah, so I guess, looking more toward literature as well, and definitely I would love to get into Carajale. I'm still learning Romanian, so I would need to perfect it to get to that level. So, yeah.
Do you think I can follow up with a comment/question?
Please.
Yes, so you hear me well? Okay. I wanted to, I think this is fascinating. And I was thinking, as you were speaking about Lovinescu, and especially the a certain kind of enchantment with French culture, and the ways in which this kind of enchantment takes different forms at different different historical moments and political moments, right? Because following up on Catarina's point, so at the end of 19th century, there is this very clear clash between, a kind of a strategic distancing from the Ottoman past and the Ottoman clear political and cultural influence, and trying very hard to claim a symbolic and political space as a new nation. Well, yeah, new nation after 1877, right? The Turkish-Russian the Ottoman Russian war that allowed Wallachia and Moldavia to become Romania. So that's one of the things, and then there is yet another tension, I would say, where you have the people who are much more interested in Francophonie, but there are also a very particular group of intellectual and politicians that are very much pro-Germany, and so that takes a totally different shape at the end, after the after the First World War, because the pro-German intelligentsia has to redefine themselves, right, in Greater Romania, and they can no longer portray themselves as basically the epitome of modernization, precisely because they are seen as politically problematic, right, with the Germany having lost the war, and be considered actually the enemy of the new Europe in 1920s. So there is a totally different political leverage associated to Francophonie in the 20s in comparison to the end of the 19th century. So you might want to keep that in mind. I think it's a very important distinction. So it wasn't really a question, it was a comment, but I think it's important to keep that in mind, especially if you look at this kind of long trajectory of what Francophonie and this enchantment with French culture would appear like at different moments in time. So thank you so much. This was fascinating.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much for the comments.
Yeah, thanks. All this feedback I think is great. So Vlad, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Keith, thank you for this really rich and wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. So my comment is actually related to Mary's comment about ambivalence, and I was thinking about your use of Benjamin specifically, and commodity culture, which is a kind of a seed of certain kind of ambivalence in general for Benjamin in relation to modernization and questions of loss, of what is lost in this process of modernization, as Mary had mentioned. And so I'm wondering, if you could do some close readings, and I don't know if you of those of that commodity culture, and the magazines that you showed us seem really rich place for that. And specifically about the presence or the traces of the Ottoman past. So is there something in that commodity culture that has sublimated that past? So in the Passage, in the arcades, right? I mean, it is kind of a sublimated, modernized bazaar in a way, but were there traces of, I'm thinking even of the Art Nouveau lines that you showed us around the boy who's carrying the petrol. I think there's some really rich material that you can kind of draw out and sort of, I'm just interested to see, do you see your project kind of going that way in terms of sort of close reading of this material culture more generally?
Yes, I would love to. I'm so grateful for it. There's a digital library of the city of Bucharest where I found these Moda Parisiana, but there's a very limited digitized collection and even limited hours of access. So I would love to, dig further into the archive and hopefully go to Romania as, on a research project to kind of dig deeper into that. And I couldn't spend time actually reading some of those articles, but I even find the forms of the language. You can see the changing language even in some of the characters that are used, and there's so much to pull out from that. Yeah.
Well, this is excellent. Thank you very much, Vlad, for this really good question about gain and loss, but also the dynamism. We're not dealing with static reality, and I believe that a lot of the presentation here have added a huge value in my mind. In our ongoing work to remind us that those things are not, first of all, happening in context or in vacuum. They're always in context, and they're dynamic. And there are multiple shades that we need to consider, otherwise the picture would be skewed. I believe that this might be, Mary, the last question for Keith today. Of course, I'll like to invite, our audience, especially the overseas audience that is braving the Friday night. And we're very happy that you are with us on Friday night at Balkan Circle. And if you don't want to comment or question, then we can congratulate Keith and wish this paper success on the incoming conference. We certainly have enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to everyone for your comments. This is super helpful. Like, as I said, I'm still putting a dissertation project together. So like Dr. Neuberger, I would love to meet about this stuff.
Absolutely. I was just thinking we need to have coffee and in person and talk about this. And just for everyone else here, we will see you next week at Balkan Circle. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much. And our audience is reminding us, not quite night, more like evening, but it was, where did this Professor Rockstegar from Croatia? Yes, time difference, but thank you for being with us, and we'll be seeing you next week. Leka večer, всичко добро желая.
Merci.
Have a good weekend.